Hello! Today we're going to speak about Britain in the 18th century, about the Glorious Revolution, about the Industrial Revolution and the colonial wars, about London and Londoners and the development of arts, about the Enlightenment, and about the outstanding figures of the English Enlightenment. In Europe, the 18th century was a turbulent age marked with revolutions, a tremendous upheaval in literature, philosophy, and science all over the continent. It was the age when England gained the dominant place in the Channel and in the seas and became the world's main market. It was the age of the Industrial Revolution, which resulted in England's economic growth. It was also the age of continental and colonial wars. The wars for colonial expansion in India and North America went on without interruption. And there, England's rivals were Holland, France, and Spain. The 18th century was a period of transition which saw the transfer of political power in Britain from absolute to parliamentary monarchy. But before we turn to the 18th century proper, we must speak about the event which set the basis for England's further development, the Glorious Revolution. For different reasons, mainly political and economic, many English historians consider the late 1680s to be the beginning of the 18th century in the history of England. In 1688, the bourgeoisie managed to bring the royal power, the armed forces, and taxation under the control of Parliament. The arrangement is known as the Revolution of 1688, or the Glorious Revolution. King James II, who succeeded to the throne after the death of his brother Charles II, introduced pro-Catholic reforms and finally converted to Catholicism himself. All that provoked Protestant hostility in the country. James II's opponents sparked off the Glorious Revolution by inviting Protestant William, the Prince of Orange, to take the English crown. William of Orange arrived with an invasion force. In fact, William III, as he came to be known, was one of the legal heirs to the throne. He was the grandson of Charles I, and his wife Mary was James II's daughter and Charles I's granddaughter. King James II had to flee to France in 1689, and Parliament declared that James II had abdicated, and William and Mary accepted the throne. The attempts to restore James II to the throne failed in 1619. William III proved to be an able diplomat, but a reserved and thus an unpopular monarch. In 1689, William and Mary accepted the Bill of Rights, curbing royal power and granting the rights of Parliament. It also restricted succession to the throne only to Protestants. The Bill of Rights laid the basis for constitutional monarchy. William and Mary ruled jointly until Mary's death in 1694, and her husband died after a fall from his horse in 1702. The most important result of the Glorious Revolution was transition from absolute to parliamentary monarchy. In 1707, during the reign of Queen Anne, Act of the Union created a single parliament for England and Scotland. Now let us speak about the political and economic development of the country. The 18th century was a sound thinking and rational age. Life was ruled by common sense. That was the proper guide to thought and conduct in commerce and industry. That period saw a remarkable rise in the fields of philosophy, natural science, and political economy. Adam Smith, the Scottish economist, wrote his Wealth of Nations in 1776. His ideas dominated the whole of industrial Europe and America until the revival of opposing theories of state control and protection. Adam Smith was one of the founders of political economy, which evolved as a science in the 18th century. Smith's ideas were further developed by David Ricardo. During the reign of George I, government power was increased because the new king spoke only German and relied on the decisions of his ministers. The most influential minister, who remained the greatest political leader of Britain for 20 years, was Robert Walpole. He is considered to have been Britain's first prime minister. Moreover, it was Robert Walpole who fathered the idea of using banknotes. As Britain was waging a series of costly wars with France, the government had to borrow money from different sources. And in 1694, a group of financiers agreed to establish a bank if the government pledged to borrow from it alone. The new bank, called the Bank of England, had authority to raise money by printing banknotes. But the idea was not entirely new. For hundreds of years, ever since the 12th century, money dealers had been giving people the so-called promissory notes signed by themselves. The checks that are used today developed from those promissory notes. Walpole also promoted a parliamentary act which obliged companies to bear responsibility to the public for the money which they borrowed by the sales of shares. In politics, Walpole was determined to keep the crown under a firm parliamentary control. He realized that with the new German monarchy that was more possible than ever before. Walpole stressed the idea that government ministers should work together in a small group called the cabinet. He insisted that all cabinet ministers should bear collective responsibility for their decisions. And if any minister disagreed with a cabinet decision, he was expected to resign. That rule is still observed today. Walpole opposed wars and he increased taxes on objects of luxury, including tea, coffee, and chocolate. Walpole's most influential enemy was William Pitt, who stressed the importance of developing trade and strengthening Britain's position overseas, even by armed force. His policies led to a number of wars with France. In the War of 1756, Pitt declared that the target was French trade, which was to be taken over by Britain. In Canada, the British Army took Quebec, which gave Britain control over fish, fur, and timber trades. The French army was also defeated in India, and a lot of Britons went to India to make their fortunes. Britain became the most powerful country in the world. British pride was expressed in a national song written in 1742, Rule Britannia. At the beginning of the 18th century, England was becoming the main commercial center of Europe. In 1700, England and Wales had a population of about 5.5 million people. By the end of the century, the population reached the figure of 8.8 million. And including Ireland and Scotland, the total population was about 13 million people. At the beginning of the 18th century, England was still a country of small villages. The big cities of the future were only beginning to emerge. After London, the second largest city was Bristol. Its rapid growth and importance was based on the triangular trade. British-made goods were shipped to West Africa. West African slaves were transported to the New World, and American sugar, cotton, and tobacco were brought to Britain. By the middle of the century, Liverpool, Manchester, Birmingham, Sheffield, and Leeds were already big cities. But administratively and politically they were still treated as villages, and they had no representation in Parliament. All towns, old and new, had no drainage system. Dirt was seldom or never removed from the streets. Towns often suffered from epidemics. In London, only 1 child in 4 grew up to become an adult. The majority of the poorer population suffered from drinking, as the most popular drink was gin. Quakers started developing the beer industry and promoting the spread of beer as a less damaging drink, and soon beer drinking became a national habit. As I've already said, at the beginning of the 18th century, England was becoming the main commercial centre of England, and London was regarded as the great centre of wealth and civilization. We can have a look at the map of London. Ships came up the Thames, which resembled a forest of masts. There was a great deal of buying, selling, and bargaining in the open. The city, or the square mile of money, became the most important district of London. The Lord Mayor was never seen in public except in his rich robe, a hood of black velvet, and a golden chain. He was always escorted by heralds and guards, and on great occasions he appeared on horseback or in his gilded coach. A commonly used phrase said, "He who is tired of London is tired of life." But the 18th century London was naturally different from what it became later. The streets were so narrow that wheeled carriages had difficulty in passing each other. Houses were built of brick and stone as well as of wood and plaster, and the upper part of the houses was built much further out than the lower part, so far out that people living on the upper floors could touch each other's hands by stretching out over the street. Houses were not numbered, as the majority of the population were illiterate. That's why shops, inns, taverns, theatres, and coffee houses had painted signs illustrating their names. The most typical names and pictures were the Red Lion, the Swan, the Golden Lamb, the Blue Bear, the Rose, and others. Londoners preferred to walk in the middle of the streets so as to avoid the rubbish thrown out of the windows and open doors. And in rainy weather, the gutters that ran along the streets turned into black torrents, which roared down to the Thames, carrying to it all the rubbish from the city. The streets were not lighted at night, and thieves and pickpockets plied their trade without fear of being punished. It was difficult to get about even during the day, let alone at night. Wealthy Londoners preferred using the river. The boatmen, dressed in blue garments, waited for customers at the head of the steps leading down to the waterside. Another way of getting about London was in a sedan chair. It was put on two long horizontal poles which were carried by two men. When ladies went out to pay visits, the lid of the sedan chair had to be opened to make room for the fashionable hairdresses and hats. The introduction of coffee, tea, and chocolate as common drinks led to the establishment of coffee houses. These were a kind of first clubs. Coffee houses kept copies of newspapers. They became centers of political discussion. Every coffee house had its own favorite speaker, to whom the visitors listened with great admiration. Each rank and profession, each shade of religious or political opinion had its own coffee house. There were earls and clergymen, university students and translators, printers and index makers. Men of literature and the wits met at a coffee house which was frequently visited by the poet John Dryden. Here one could also meet Sir Isaac Newton, Dr. Johnson, and other celebrities. As it has already been said, the 18th century was the age of the Industrial Revolution. It brought about the mechanization of industry and the consequent changes in social and economic organization. The change from domestic industry to the factory system began in the textile industry. It was transformed by such inventions as Kay's flying shuttle in 1733, Hargreaves' spinning jenny made in 1764, and other machines. Newcomen's steam engine, invented in 1705 and perfected by James Watt in 1765, provided a water supply. Communications were improved by the first locomotives invented by Stephenson. The 18th century improvements in agricultural methods freed rural labor for industry and increased the productivity of the land. That was followed by the rapid growth of towns, mostly near coal fields and coal mines. Miserable working and housing conditions later inspired the Luddites, or workers who deliberately smashed machinery in the industrial centers in the early 19th century. The followers of Ned Ludd, an 18th century riot leader, believed that the use of machines caused unemployment. They fought against unemployment in a most primitive way, which for them seemed effective. At the end of the 18th century, the struggle of the 13 American colonies for independence from British rule turned into the War of American Independence, which lasted from 1775 to 1783. The war was caused by the British attempts to tax the colonies for revenue and to make them pay for a standing army. The colonies revolted under George Washington and declared their independence in 1776. Later, in 1778 to 1780, France, Spain, and the Netherlands, one by one, declared war on Britain. Military operations were held on the American continent. In 1781, Britain lost command of the sea and her army was finally defeated at Yorktown. In 1783, the war ended with the Treaty of Paris, in which the independence of the USA was officially recognized. George Washington became the country's first president. The war discredited the government of George III, it weakened France financially, and it served as an inspiration for the French Revolution and for revolutions in the Spanish colonies in America. It should be noted that the War of Independence was won by the Americans largely due to the French support. The famous poet and playwright Beaumarchais, who was a secret agent of the French government, shipped arms and ammunition over the Atlantic Ocean to the insurgents. In Paris, he met Benjamin Franklin, who was the American minister or ambassador to France. Franklin is one of the prominent figures in American history. To begin with, he helped to draft the Declaration of Independence in 1776. Besides being one of the founding fathers of the American nation, Franklin gained a worldwide reputation for his scientific discoveries, which included a new theory of the nature of electricity. He was also famous for his inventions, among which there was the lightning conductor. Now let us look at the development of arts. Britain's naval supremacy in the 18th century gave rise to marine painting. Victories at sea led to a steady demand for pictures of sea battles, and a number of artists with seafaring experience made a good living from naval commissions. Another factor that promoted marine painting was a changing attitude towards the sea and the seashore. Many of the novelists, poets, and artists turned to the sea as a source of inspiration. Another fashionable trend was painting animal scenes. The master of such painting was George Stubbs. The 18th century was also the great age of British landscape and portrait painting. Sir Joshua Reynolds, William Hogarth, and Thomas Gainsborough were the great masters of the century. They debated whether painting should follow poetry. Joshua Reynolds was more academic in his views and manner of painting. That English portrait painter dominated English artistic life in the middle and late 18th century. Through his art and teaching, he attempted to lead British painting away from the indigenous pictures of the early 18th century, which were, well, joking, anecdotal, and he wanted to lead them away toward the formal rhetoric of the continental grand style. With the founding of the Royal Academy of Arts in 1768, Reynolds was elected its first president, and he was knighted by King George III and became Sir Joshua Reynolds. Thomas Gainsborough was known for his portraits of fashionable society in the late 18th century and for his landscapes of the English countryside. His art could be described as natural. One of Gainsborough's celebrated works is his portrait of Mr. and Mrs. Andrews, featuring a wealthy Suffolk landowner and his wife against the background of their estate. William Hogarth was a major English painter, printmaker, pictorial satirist, social critic, and editorial cartoonist. He is best known for his moral and satirical engravings and paintings, and may well be called a painter and engraver of modern moral subjects. All three of those authors, or those artists, unmistakably are recognized as the 18th century greatest English artists, whose pictures belong to the treasure trove of European painting. In music, the leading musician of the century was George Frederick Handel. He was a musician and composer of German birth and a naturalized Englishman. He composed with extreme facility. For example, Messiah was written within 21 days only. His immense output includes over 40 operas, about 20 oratorios, organ concerts, vocal and choral music, and a great mass of chamber and instrumental music. The best-known opera is Rinaldo. Even his religious and formal music is dominated by the influence of the theatre. Handel's music expresses the full range of human feelings. It is profoundly psychological and subtle. Handel was patronized by the king. In fact, he was the royal composer. But he sometimes fell victim to the intrigues of courtiers and politicians who wanted him to support their cause in front of the king. Handel was bitterly criticized by a group of playwrights and composers who insisted on promoting a specific national way in English music. Among them was John Gay, a poet and playwright. His most famous work, a lyrical drama, The Beggar's Opera, was turned into a music piece by John Pepusch, another German composer, mostly known for his vocal music. This new musical comedy was based on the plot suggested by Jonathan Swift. On the one hand, it was a bitter political satire on politicians, but on the other hand, it was witty and joyful. In the second act, a group of robbers marched to the music from Handel's opera Rinaldo. Well, of course, it was a terrible blow to Handel's pride.
It's a season made for joy, love is then our duty. She alone who that employs, well deserves her beauty. Let's be gay while we may, beauty's a power disguised in decay. Just a season made for joy, love is then our duty. Let us quick as for today, as if not tomorrow. Love like death but we will lay, love is not the sorrow. Don't let sing, fight for the good, don't get lost in the sorrow. Let us quick as for today, as if not tomorrow.
Well, the Beggar's Opera was a tremendous success, and during the winter season of 1728, it was performed 62 times. Now it's time to speak about the Enlightenment. The problem of vital importance for the 18th century philosophers and writers was the study of man and the origin of his good and evil qualities. Human nature, they claimed, was virtuous, and any deviation from virtue was due to the influence of vicious society. Formulated in that way, the problem acquired social importance. The survivals of feudalism on the one hand, and the evils of the new system of production on the other hand, were to be seen everywhere. Progressive writers explained that vice was caused by ignorance, and the way out was through enlightening the people. Thus, the 18th century English writers started a public movement of enlightenment. They hoped to improve the world by teaching and bringing the light of knowledge to the population. The enlighteners rejected church dogmas and class distinctions. Here we must stress that the movement of the Enlightenment appeared in England and later spread to the continent. France produced eminent writers who fought for enlightening the people, such as Voltaire, Rousseau, and others. In every country, supporters of the Enlightenment shared the same views: a deep hatred for feudalism and its survivals, systematic education for all, self-government, and liberty. They all spoke up for the ordinary people, particularly for peasants, whose fate was to be decided in the 18th century. Notwithstanding those common features, there was a difference between the ideas expressed by the English and those expressed by the French writers of the period. An intellectual calm is felt in English literature, because the English were already past their revolution, while in France the turbulent spirit of the fight for freedom was only beginning to emerge. The French literature of the Enlightenment prepared the French for the Great Revolution, which broke out at the end of the 18th century. In England, the period saw the transition from the poetic age of Shakespeare to the prosaic age of essayists. The style of prose became clear, graceful, and polished. Writers accepted such literary forms as were intelligible to all. Satire gained popularity. The period also saw the rise of the political pamphlet. Most of the authors of the time wrote political pamphlets, but the best came from the pens of Daniel Defoe and Jonathan Swift. Among the best-known essayists were Steele and Addison. Periodical newspapers had been published since the Civil War, and in 1702 the first daily newspaper was established. Much of the drama was written in prose, and the leading form of literature was the novel. The hero of the novel was no longer a prince or any other nobleman, but a representative of the middle class. That had never happened before. Ordinary people had usually been represented only as comical characters. Towards the middle of the century, there appeared a new literary trend, sentimentalism. Richardson, Goldsmith, Fielding, those names evoked a lively response in the hearts of readers both in Europe and across the Atlantic Ocean. The first writer of the sentimental school in Europe was Samuel Richardson. His novels Pamela and History of Sir Charles Grandison were the works that showed the inner world of the characters. Richardson appealed to the hearts of the readers and made them sympathize with his unfortunate heroes. I repeat that his novels were a tremendous success in the 18th and 19th centuries all over Europe, including Russia. We can say that the English writers of the Enlightenment formed two groups. Those who hoped to better the world merely by teaching were Joseph Addison, who wrote essays, Richard Steele, who wrote essays and comedies, Daniel Defoe, you're going to see him later, he is the author of Robinson Crusoe, Alexander Pope, the author of The Rape of the Lock, and Samuel Richardson, the author of Pamela. The other group included the writers who openly protested against the vicious social order. Those were Jonathan Swift, the author of Gulliver's Travels, again we're going to speak about him later on, Henry Fielding, who wrote The History of Tom Jones, a Foundling, Oliver Goldsmith, the author of The Vicar of Wakefield, Richard Sheridan, the author of The School for Scandal, Tobias Smollett, who wrote Peregrine Pickle, Robert Burns, who wrote poems chiefly in the Scottish dialect. The poetry of the 18th century was didactic and satirical. It was the poetry of the town and its fashionable life, as well as the poetry of worldly wisdom. And the leading poet of the time, and even of the century, was Alexander Pope, one of the first English classicists. Pope had little contact with the average reader, and in order to read and enjoy Pope, one had to be familiar with the works of Virgil, Horace, and the Greek poet Theocritus. In 1715, Pope published his translations of the Iliad and the Odyssey by Homer, which made him famous. Pope had a delicate sense of style, which he polished to the last degree of gleaming finish. His poems, such as The Rape of the Lock, are notable for their elegant style. Pope organized a society of literary men who called themselves the Martin Scriblerus Club. Martin Scriblerus was an imaginary figure. Anyone who wished to publish a satire in a magazine was allowed to use his name as a pseudonym. Pope hoped that when put together, those stories would make an interesting book. But that never happened, and all those stories remained isolated compositions. And yet it was Martin Scriblerus that inspired Jonathan Swift to write the famous novel Gulliver's Travels. Now, before we speak about Swift and Defoe, we must speak on about poetry and about Robert Burns, who lived from 1759 to 1796. Robert Burns, who is rightly considered to be the national pride of Scotland, began writing poetry at the age of 15. He fell in love and wrote his first poem. But it was only 10 years later that his first volume of poems was published. Those were poems chiefly in the Scottish dialect. The book won him immediate success. The source of Burns's poetry is Scottish folklore. Burns was deeply aware of the dignity and equality of men. He wrote epigrams on idle noblemen, and at the same time he composed tender lyrical verses. "O my love's like a red, red rose, John Barleycorn, the tree of liberty, Auld Lang Syne," these famous poems and songs have been popular for 2 centuries. The Burns Festival is held every year with people coming from all over the world. My Heart's in the Highlands is one of the most favorite Scottish poems by Robert Burns. My heart's in the Highlands, my heart is not here. My heart's in the Highlands, a-chasing the deer, a-chasing the wild deer and following the roe. My heart's in the Highlands, wherever I go. Most of Burns's poems were written in Scots. They document and celebrate traditional Scottish culture. Burns wrote in a variety of forms: letters to friends, ballads, and songs. He is well known for the over 300 songs which celebrate love, friendship, work, and drink, often with hilarious and tender sympathy. Even today, he is often referred to as the national bard of Scotland. You're now going to watch a video extract about a very unusual Robert Burns club in Scotland.
Another source of inspiration for the oral tradition of the Scots can be found in the Bachelors' Club, Tarbone. Every year, the birthday of Robert Burns is celebrated here by the literary and debating society founded by the poet. It's in the nostalgic recollection of Burns that Lowland Scots, the language of his finest lyrics, still gladden Scottish hearts around the world. Tonight, Willie Ross will toast the immortal memory.
Mr. Chairman and friends, I don't think there's any more daunting task can be asked of any Scotsman, and certainly not of an Ayrshire-man, than that of proposing the immortal memory of Robert Burns.
Before his death at the age of 37, it was Burns' achievement as a poet to shun the fashion for English and draw on a Scottish tradition that had become despised. He restored his nation's voice and gave Scots a new pride.
These songs. Songs that a quarter of them are masterpieces. Banks and breeze, Auld Lang Syne. My love is like a red, red rose that's newly sprung in June. My love is like the melodies so sweetly played in tune. As fair art thou, my bonny lass, so deep in love am I, and I will love thee still, my dear, till all the seas gang dry. And they say we're tongue-tied as Scots when it comes to love. Don't you believe it? We've got burdens to draw upon, and we can glory in the fact that he saved part of the language of Scotland, and he gave us this glorious treasury. It's almost equal with the name of Scotland. Gentlemen, I ask you to
And now for Samuel Johnson. Dr. Johnson is little known outside Britain, but in his time he was a popular English poet, essayist, biographer, lexicographer, and a critic of English literature. In the words of a modern scholar, he was a great literary personality. He compiled and published the Dictionary of the English Language in 1755. Despite common assumptions that Dr. Johnson wrote the first dictionary of the English language, we must say that there had been nearly 20 so-called English dictionaries in the preceding 150 years. Johnson's dictionary was to rise above all those because of his meticulous research, his depth and breadth of definitions, and his careful use of description. This is a page from Samuel Johnson's Dictionary of the English Language. Samuel Johnson was the son of a poor bookseller. He attended Lichfield Grammar School, and a few weeks after he turned 19, he became a student of Oxford University. But after 13 months, poverty forced him to leave Oxford without taking a degree, and he returned to Lichfield. Just before the publication of his dictionary, Oxford University awarded Johnson the degree of Master of Arts, and in 1775, Oxford University awarded him an honorary doctorate. The two outstanding figures of the 18th century literature of England were Jonathan Swift and Daniel Defoe. Let us start with Swift, who was born in 1667 and died in 1745. Swift was an Irish-born Englishman who spent a large part of his life in Ireland. He got a bachelor's degree in 1686, and for a long time he had to work as a private secretary and accountant to Sir William Temple. Sir William Temple was a statesman and a courtier who resided at Moor Park, not far from London. And although Sir William liked the young man, the ambitious Swift considered that he was treated just a little better than a servant. So, in 1692, Swift went to Oxford to take his master's degree. After that, he became a vicar at a little parish church in Ireland. Later, though, he returned to Sir William Temple and continued working for him, writing pamphlets and satires in his spare time. Swift was one of the most critical and sarcastic journalists of the time. One of his best-known pamphlets was The Tale of the Tub. Swift was wonderfully popular in England and especially in Ireland. The Lord Governor of Ireland once said that all he managed to do in Ireland was done with the kind permission of Mr. Swift. But Swift's life could hardly be called happy. By the end of his life, he became even more embittered and satirical than before. Swift's misfortunes and the death of his wife undermined his health. In 1740, his memory and reason were gone. He became completely deaf. He wouldn't touch food if there was anyone present in the room, and he died in Dublin in 1745. What brought Swift real fame was his book Gulliver's Travels. In that book, Swift satirized the evils of the existing society. That was altogether a novelty in English literature. At first, Swift intended to publish the book as the story of Martin Scribblerus, but later he heard of a farmer called Gulliver, who was a real giant, a tall and manly fellow, so strong that he could carry a horse across a fence. That impressed Swift tremendously, and that is how his favorite character got his name. The first two travels, to the land of Lilliputians and to the land of Brobdingnag, or to the land of the giants, are well known as children's entertaining reading. In the description of his third voyage to the floating island of Laputa and to the fourth, the land of the intelligent horses, Swift abandons delicate fancy and unmasks the selfish and brutal nature of humanity. He shows the stupidity of the so-called academicians and the true nature of human civilization. In the land of the intelligent horses, humans called yahoos are shown as filthy, degenerated creatures unable to speak clearly or to do any decent work. The book is written with wonderful energy and polemical skill. It has been translated into many languages and it is read and enjoyed by thousands of readers. Now let us speak about Daniel Defoe, who was born in 1661 and died in 1731. Daniel Defoe was born in London to the family of a butcher who was a dissenter, that is, a nonconformist. Their family name was Foe, F-O-E, and you can see their family name under this portrait. Daniel was about 40 years of age when he first changed his signature of Defoe into Defoe, and then Defoe in one word. Daniel got the best education his father could afford. The boy was to become a minister in the nonconformist church. Therefore, at the age of 14, he was placed in an academy for a full course of 5 years. But when his training was completed, he refused to devote himself to the church. In his opinion, that work was neither honorable and pleasant nor profitable. He decided to go into business and become a merchant. But although he was very energetic and practical, a businessman to his fingertips, Defoe never succeeded in business. He went bankrupt several times. What he used to say was, 30 times I was rich and 30 times I was poor. The only branch of business in which he proved to be successful was journalism. When Defoe was 23, he started writing pamphlets. Usually, he was very outspoken and wrote what he really thought. That's why his pamphlets often got him into trouble. In 1685, he took part in the revolt led by the Duke of Monmouth, the illegitimate son of Charles II, against James II. Monmouth hoped to get the crown with the help of the Protestants, but the rebellion was put down and Defoe had a narrow escape. As for the Duke of Monmouth, he was beheaded. When the Protestant king William III came to power in 1688, Defoe wrote pamphlets praising his policy. It was the beginning of his literary career. Defoe anticipated the greatest public improvement of modern times: higher education for women, the protection of seamen, the construction of highways, and the opening of savings banks. He urged the establishment of a special academy to study literature and languages. Owing to the fact that William III was the king of the Whig party, he was attacked by the Tories, who called him contemptuously Dutch William. Some Tories demanded in pamphlets that the English race should be kept pure. Opposing this foolish idea, Defoe wrote the pamphlet The True-Born Englishman, in which he proved that a true-born Englishman did not exist, since the English nation consisted of Danes, Picts, Scots, Angles, Saxons, Normans, and other peoples. He said, "A true-born Englishman is a contradiction in speech, an irony, in fact, a fiction." And the king personally thanked Defoe for the pamphlet. During the reign of Queen Anne, persecution of the dissenters began again, and in 1702, Defoe wrote a pamphlet in defense of the dissenters. He entitled it The Shortest Way with the Dissenters. In that pamphlet, he attacked the Tories and the established church. But the irony in the pamphlet was so subtle that his enemies did not recognize it at first. They considered the pamphlet to be next best to the Bible. And when they finally realized the real character of the pamphlet, Defoe was arrested and then sentenced to 7 years imprisonment. And to disgrace him even more, his enemies, the Tories, subjected him to standing in the pillory in a public square. Well, here is Defoe standing in the pillory. But before he was taken to prison, Defoe wrote his Hymn to the Pillory, in which he demanded a fair trial. And although the hymn was not published, Defoe's friends made it popular. It was sung on street corners on the day of the public execution, and many of the poorer Londoners who knew Defoe well gathered round the pillory, forming a live fence and preventing the crowd from tormenting him. Women threw flowers to him. Well, you can see the flowers there. When the time came to set him free, people cheered him and carried him from the square on their shoulders. That was the climax of his political career, and at the same time, that was the end of it. After his release, Defoe worked as an editor of a journal which supported the ruling party or his former enemies. After the death of Queen Anne, the Whigs came to power, and Defoe continued serving the new ruling party. And all that time he was regularly receiving money from the government. But the English government never paid money for nothing, only for some services rendered to the crown. Later it turned out that Defoe had been in Her Majesty's Secret Service. Where are the books? Yeah. In 1719, Defoe tried his hand in fiction and finally wrote the famous novel about the adventures of Robinson Crusoe. The idea of writing about a man who had to live on a desert island was taken from a story published in Steele's magazine, The Englishman. It was about a sailor, Alexander Selkirk, who had spent 4 years and 4 months on a desert island. Defoe's Robinson Crusoe spent 26 years alone on the island. Here are some more pictures. Robinson Crusoe. The novel praises human labor and the triumph of man over nature. Labor and fortitude help Robinson to endure hardships. They save him from despair, and the very process of hard work gives him satisfaction. Defoe is a great master of realistic detail. When reading his description of Crusoe's life and work, one feels that the author must have lived through all the adventures himself. The charm of the novel lies in Robinson as a person. He develops into a strong-willed man able to withstand the calamities of life. The novel is a study of man. It is a great work showing man in relation to nature and civilization. When Robinson Crusoe was published, Defoe became famous and came into money. He was now able to pay all his debts. He built himself a house and kept a coach and a pleasure boat. It is said that not long before his death, Defoe fell victim to a serious mental disease. In 1729, he was at work on a new book. Part of it was already in print when he broke off abruptly and fled. He was very fond of his wife and daughters, but he did not want them to know his hiding place. And for 2 years he lived in poverty and quite alone, and finally died in 1731. The inscription on his gravestone simply says, Daniel Defoe, author of Robinson Crusoe. Thank you. Bye.